Our next presenter is Dr. Casey Bohn. She's the Director of Behavioral Biology at Johns Hopkins University. Today, she's going to be talking about behavior, ecology, diversity, and welfare. Take it away, Dr. Bohn.
All right. Hi, everybody. This might be a little bit of a whirlwind because there's just so much information. I realized my title was not the best at explaining what I was going to do. So I of course, everyone knew about bats. So I want to change my roadmap a little bit. Well, this is what my brain was on. So a better description is, what are they? And I know a lot of you already know, so this may be a little redundant. But I'm then going to go to why a bat is not a bat is not a bat, which will be a continuing theme. And then I'm going to talk about my specialty, which is their behavior. Okay, so let's talk about what are they. And I do still bring this up because this really is recent. Like, even 30 years ago, we didn't know where bats went, right? And you still, even today, even among zoologists, sometimes they think that bats are actually flying rodents. Makes sense. They're small. And in multiple languages, the word for bat literally is flying rodent. But about 30 years ago, through some genetic work, and we've gotten more and more genetic work, it ends up that bats are nowhere near rodents or primates, etc. In fact, I want to spread this around so that you can use it. The bats are even less flying rodents than humans are walking rodents, right? So humans are more closely related to rodents than bats are, all right? But why am I talking about this? Well, it hasn't just ended, right? We are getting more and more information about the evolution of mammals very recently. So this is 2022. They're getting better at developing kind of molecular clocks. And there's some things I want to highlight here. First of all, on the y-axis here, we're talking the Cretaceous period. We're talking about 80 million years ago, right? Where you have this little branching point. I'm hoping everyone can see my mouse right here. And then you have bats, right here. And then you have this node right here, which is where bats come into play, right? So this branching point is one of the earliest, not quite the earliest, but one of the earliest branches within this supergroup, okay? So that means even though you often see in some of these figures that, oh, here it looks like a bat is closely related to a pangolin, and then some will say it's a dog. Well, the answer is they're not really closely related to anything. They diverged before we even got any of these other groups, which means they're really weird, right? And not only are they really weird, as you all know, there's a ton of them, right? So everything in yellow here, right? And I also have given this is 2022. Everything yellow here, those are all bat species, right? And this also includes a lot of the dates. So these are millions of years ago. So another important aspect, bats are older than dogs, right? Or other carnivora. They are older than our ungulates, right? So bats are very separated, and two, very old, all right? So what are they, right? So, well, some things that we can say about bats. What are bats, right? Well, one, it's a huge clade. It's a huge group. We're talking 1,400 species, a quarter of all mammals, right? What else can we say? They are ancient, not ancient in the sense that they have not evolved recently, but they diverged from other mammals, around 80 million years ago, right? And because of this divergence, they do not have a lot of close sister taxa. That is, they're not closely related to any other modern clade on our evolutionary tree, okay? The closest, of course, are other in the Laraceatheria group, but that includes things as different as whales, as it does ungulates and carnivores. In fact, I kind of like to think about bats a little bit like cetaceans in that they are so hyper specialized. It's very hard to draw comparisons with other closely related taxa, right? All right. And then finally, we are still figuring it out. Okay, so a little bit of what are bats. All right. Now, that said, what are bats? I also want to say, hey, but a bat is not a bat is not a bat. And I bring this up because this is from Teeling 2005 of a phylogeny of bats. It's also another one in 2011. It was very variable. It appears to be much more consistent, right? And these are years basically here. So ends up that this is a bit older than they expected. But when we think about things like our old world bats, including rhinolophids, your pteropodids, they diverged very early, like 60 million years ago. So even though they look like a bat, they are very, very different. Okay. And then, of course, we have Emballonurids noctilian and Noctilionidae, which includes phylostomids. These are our new, phylostomids are our New World bats. Emballonurids are both New World and Old World, as are our Vespertilionids. Okay. So they're very diverse, right? And this radiation, particularly, most of these nodes happened 30 to 50 million years ago. All right. And so this makes it not very surprising. This is actually a little bit old because we're now at 1,400 species. But why we say a bat is not a bat? Well, you've got, the smallest mammal is a bat. You've got wingspans of 6 feet. You've got every single continent, pretty much, except for the parts of the Arctic and Antarctica. And you have bats that do just about everything, right? You've got your famous vampire bats, your carnivorous bats, your nectar feeder bats, frugivores, and yes, a lot of these are phylostomids because these are all bats I've captured over the years and released. You've got omnivorous bats, and I'm actually going to talk about these little guys. Note they're covered in pollen. And then we have insectivores, right? And this is a phylostomid insectivore. These are Brazilian free-tailed or Mexican free-tailed bats. I'll also talk about those guys today, right? So again, one last figure to highlight how diverse these bats are. This is Phylostomidae, and note within that family, you have bats that pretty much eat everything and are extremely different. When you really, other than the fact that they fly and they use echolocation, they look remarkably different and are remarkably different. All right. Now, not only is it because they eat different things, but they are also designed to fly and use different habitats. This looks like a very complicated diagram. I'm going to make it very simple. But so basically on the top part of the graph, this has a bunch of different species. To broadly say you have, in a very broad context, you have bats that are really good at flying in the open. And you have bats that are really good at flying in cluttered environments. And most, and there is a trade-off there. Bats are not good. A particular species is generally not very good at doing both very well, right? So there are some, in particular, a lot of our Vespertilionids that might be right here on the edge, but they're not going to be super good at flying high, fast, and long. And your guys that can flutter and move around really small environments are not going to be very good at flying long distances. Okay. And that in turn, combined with their echolocation, means that each species, even if and here we're talking about insectivores, just insectivores, have extremely specialized niches, both acoustically and as far as their flight. So some are very good at flying in the open, particularly your molluskids, by the way. And then even within Vespertilionids, you have some that are really good, again, at flying in closed spaces. Big brown bats would be kind of like right around here. They're kind of edge flyers, etc. So a bat, so as we said, on the one hand, there are characteristics that make bats bats. On the other hand, just to keep in mind that a bat is not a bat is not a bat. And we just don't have more names for them, which I think we really should think about doing, right? But I'm going to go back to what are they, right? And so now we're going to say, okay, what can we think of, especially in when we're talking about their welfare, captivity, etc.? What features do bats share? Right. All right. So they do. They all fly. Okay. That's one. Okay. Number two, they're nocturnal. Pretty much. I mean, there's some that are active diurnally, right? But generally, they're nocturnal. Okay. Number three, most, and again, I'm well aware, not all, use echolocation. And I don't know the percentage that are pteropodidae, but it's not very large within that 1,400 species of bats. Okay. So for all those that do use echolocation, in case you weren't completely awed and amazed at what these bats do, this means again that they're using sound to navigate while flying, while capturing a flying insect. It's absolutely remarkable. And this makes it kind of obvious why it's really hard in captivity to redo this, right? We pretty much have to go with mealworms. But I also wanted to, given my experience, I've worked extensively with Cindy Moss, who has done extensive work on echolocation in big brown bats. And I wanted to share a couple of their videos because it really highlights how Okay, let me do. All right. All right, I have one more. Okay. All right. So bats use echolocation. Those are examples of big brown bats. But I'm going to go and jump again to the fact that bats are super diverse, right? In fact, so if you look at, these are kind of spectrograms of the calls, they vary immensely, right? And this isn't surprising. Again, this group, for example, so your Hippocytarides, they evolved or separated 65 million years ago. So even though they all use echolocation, there is also extreme variation across species in the form of that echolocation. All right. So echolocation, most, right? The other thing that is a defining characteristic of bats is that they are actually K species, that is long-lived, low reproducing, and they fit way off the charts of anything when it comes to mammals, right? They don't have a mouse here, but the mouse is like way down here, right? So they do not fit the kind of size versus longevity or reproduction, if we were to also do this figure with reproduction per year, you would see a similar relationship. That is, elephants reproduce more slowly than, say, mice. Okay. Bats are also more on, they're not quite elephants, but are also more on the large K species type of reproduction than anything else that is their size. Okay. And here you can see this is true whether you're talking about little vespers. They're the ones that have been found to be up to 40 years. We also have some pteropods in this figure and phylostomids, right? So this means that not only does this have huge ramifications for their behavior, it also has huge ramifications for their physiology. And I don't think we really know the extent to which this kind of unique biological clock affects so many aspects of their health and medical care in captivity, right? And again, just showing here, here's all your other mammals, and then you've got bats. The only thing that's sitting up there is a naked mole rat, right? So I would argue this is definitely a defining species, defining characteristics of bats. Okay, but I'm going to add two more, which is going to bring me to my next section of my talk. The majority of bats, and I'm not going to say all, but the majority are highly social, right? And the majority of bats are highly vocal. Okay, so what do I mean? And how do we know, right? And that's where I kind of sub-name this talk, this part of the talk, the secret lives of bats, because given that they're nocturnal, they freaking do everything in ultrasound that we can't hear. They tend to be in these huge groups. We are still trying to figure out, bat behaviors. And I'm going to give some examples, but there are many more out there. And this certainly does not mean that all bats are going to behave the same as the ones that I'm giving. That said, the majority of bats live with other bats. There are very few species that are solitary, and this can be loosely together in these kind of aggregations. Okay, it can be in specific social groups, which is really quite common. All right, and you often see this with specific individual social groups. It can be in a tree where you just have one group. This one is actually in a cave, but they're in the whole. All the bats of the same species are in this little tight cluster. And I'm going to talk a little bit about even bats that we often thought were in these there's no organization. They're in these big aggregations, particularly like Brazilian free-tail bat. Ends up, no, it's not just a free-for-all. And I'll come back to that towards the end. Now, the ones I wanted to talk about, I actually did my doctoral work on these guys. Right. And these are not pteropods. These are phylostomids. All right. And this goes on and on and on. Okay. They are, you go into a cave and normally you don't hear anything, but these bats are so large, all of their bickering and all their stuff you can actually hear. So not only is it raining guano on top of you, but it's also just this cacophony of constant social behavior and vocalizations going on. And these bats I bring up because they're kind of at the extreme end of the spectrum. That is, these bats actually live in societies. So each of these circles is a roost location. And researchers over 20 years studied this cave off and on. And we have found bats in the same group, right? These are all females and their babies in the same group 20 years later. And what's more remarkable about this is not only that they're in these stable social groups, but I don't have time to show you all the data, but they are not related to each other, right? These are buddy groups, right? And why would you be in these very stable social groups, right? And the answer is, well, cooperation, right? It also probably doesn't hurt because these bats can be carnivorous and really do a heck of harm on each other. All right. So each of these groups is highly stable. Note this is a chimney that has like 4 groups, but each day I can go in and I can pretty much tell you which bat is going to be where in the entire cave. And there are about 500 to 700 bats in there. Okay. All right. So one big aspect of bats, especially Microchiroptera. Hold on. Sorry. Sorry. There was a chat and I got sidetracked. Okay. So Microchiroptera and pretty much all bats, because they fly, they give birth. They have young that can't fly. That's what these kind of bald blobs are. And then, but the females need to still go out and forage. And there are some species that will carry their pups. Most of them, though, they leave them behind. So they go out and forage. And this happens to up to 6 weeks, and they leave all the babies behind. Here we have, this is 6 weeks later. They're almost going to be flying. Nope, there's no adults around. They're already out foraging, right? And so what I was looking at is what happens when the moms leave. And what we found is that the pups often would fall from the ceiling of the cave and to the floor. And for a bat, well, first, particularly for these bats, the floor of the cave is death, right? It is knee deep in guano, cockroaches that could carry off small children, much less baby pups, not to mention snakes, rodents, and anything else that can get down there. So the floor of the cave is death, okay? And I'm going to do a side note there that the ground for pretty much all bats, except for maybe your vampire bats, they can run, and trichops, your frog-eating bats, the ground is death. And so never have a bat on the ground, like ever. So just because that was my little side tangent, right? Because it is going to instantaneously cause stress. Now, going back to my story, it ends up that, some females would stay behind, but oftentimes they would leave all the pups. Once the pups were down on the ground, they have no way to get back up to the roost site. So what they could do is crawl up the side of the cave and make a call, right? And this is slowed down so you can hear it. And you're probably wondering why that bat has these beautiful white streaks. That was, and no, they handled it quite well. That was Clairol bleach for humans, but we put it on bats so we could identify them. But as you noticed, there were a lot of bats there, right? And so this is what generally you would expect to happen. Bat comes down, it checks out the pup, and mother should come and go pick it up. Right. Right. So bat shows up. This is C, by the way, which was from risk group 3. Doing a little sniff. But generally what we would expect. Okay, so here's baby pup Spot, mother Spot. Mother says, oh yeah, that's my baby. Goes through. Note this takes a lot of time. She's got to groom. She's got to get the pup attached. And it actually takes 5-10 minutes before they eventually fly off. All right. So seems like a pretty easy story, but then we started seeing all sorts of crazy stuff. And I know the videos are a little old, but note this is not a roost site. There should never be any bats here. They're only here because there is a baby here. And that bat just bit the pup, and all the other bats just came in and swarmed the bat that bit the pup, right? So again, the bat roosts are like up at the top. They never are on the walls of the cave. They just do this when there's a pup around, right? And so to make a long story short, what ended up happening, right? Well, the pups that were bitten, or I should say the females that bit pups were not from the same social group. Meanwhile, females from the same social group would fly down and mob any bat that harassed a pup that was not the females, but one of her group mates, right? So we basically had females from the same social group, even with their own pups sitting in their roost site, they would leave their pup, go down and get into these brawls to protect the pups of group mates, right? And sometimes they just sit there on the wall of the cave, just kind of hanging out, right? And so we, through a lot of other experiments, we've defined this as pup guarding. And a side note is that, one question is everyone was like, well, maybe bats are just dumb and don't know it's their pup. So I did have phylostomists in captivity. I worked with them for about 5 years and basically showed that they can tell the difference between the various pup isolation calls, etc. So that kind of a side note, right? So these projects were mostly in the field, but I also had a laboratory component. All right. Now you might say, aha, she's got the story. Well, the question is, we still don't know what the mechanism is for cooperation, right? Given that these bats live 20 to 30 years, are we actually going to even know what maintains this cooperation? Because we know it's not kin selection. They're not doing this for their own pups, and they are not doing this for genetic relatives, right? Presumably, there is more complex systems of cooperation in the species, right? So I'm hoping that this, a lot of people hadn't seen this. It's a little bit old, but I like it because it highlights some of the, behavior that can occur in bats. And again, not all, and how difficult it is to really tease it apart, right? And Phyllostomus estatus are not the only cooperators. I'm sure you've all heard about the absolutely lovely vampire bats that will essentially donate blood, and this is maintained through reciprocal altruism, right? So we've got some pretty extensive social behavior. And when it was taken, you might say, well, this is the whole story, right? That, the blood sharing. No, they're all fighting to give blood, donate blood to this hungry bat. But recent research has actually found that, and in fact, it's kind of cool because we've got a couple vampires here, that they actually forage together too. So it's not like, oh, I just reciprocate in one area, maybe with food, or say in Phyllostomus with pup care, but they likely are also cooperating with foraging and with roost sites. Okay. And there's more, right? So those are a couple of phylostomates. I've been involved in some other projects where we're actually trying to kind of draw larger comparisons across bats. So these are network analyses, and it kind of shows that even though, for example, Desmodus, they have their tight social groups, note they do interact with other social groups, right? And this has varying degrees of relevance to whether or not they're related to each other. So for example, Phyllostomus here, relatedness is not very high. These are Thyroptera, relatedness is very high, right? That can predict the amount of association, okay? And this study includes some work on Vespertilionids, your little evening bats, right? This is Nyctisias and a couple of Myotis species, right? So as you can see here, though, this is a bit less of what we think of when we have the Phyllostomus in their specific groups. And indeed, there's been more and more research that shows that bats tend to have these fission-fusion type dynamics, right? Some have these long-term kind of stable social groups, but many have kind of this fission fusion. And even in a colony that may look very large, there are likely lots of subgroups. And there are likely preferred and non-preferred roost mates within whatever. And this, I would say, is true for pretty much all bats. Maybe not all. There's a couple of loners out there, right? And so there's some reasons for that. Why roost with, why have buddies if you're not cooperating? Well, they do share information. That's been shown in a lot of different studies. I bet you more research and we'll find out more. This might be particularly important with enrichment. See who's learning, who's sharing, who's watching others. Most species that you can detect some level of allogrooming. And then, of course, aggression avoidance. You've heard some of the vocalizations in Phyllostomus. Bats squabble. They're little, I call them kind of little bitches. They squabble a lot. And the squabbles are about, oh, you bumped into me and I want to be in this location. And it might be over food, but bats are squabblers. And by having these preferred having preferred roost mates, they can reduce the amount of that kind of squabbling and potential aggression. Another reason for that is what males are around particular roost sites. And I'm going to bring that up in my next section. All right. Now, the other thing that bats normally do, and this, again, this varies, or many species do, is roost switching. That is, we gave the example of Phyllostomus, but many bats, they move from roost to roost or micro roost within a large roost. That is, they're not in necessarily the same location. You might find the same bats, but they might move to a different location. All right. And this can be also for your tree roosters. They change trees regularly, but also within, say, a cave. You can have them, and not necessarily Phyllostomus, but many species, they roost at one location and then they might move to another location. And this can have two things we know this is related to, of course, is parasites and thermal dynamics, right? But the other thing I really want to emphasize on the social side is that actually whether or not that micro roost is defendable. Is it a large, how many bats can fit in that maybe little crevice or larger crevice? And is the structure of it such that it can be defended, right? Because there are bats that may want to be in a defendable roost, and there are bats that may not want to be in a defendable roost. And particularly when we say defendable, often that is by males. And you're going to have males that are going to be your potentially roost defenders, and others that are kind of cruising around and, don't mean to be sexist, but probably harassing some females. All right, so there's some bit on social behavior, and as I mentioned, the dudes, right? So, and another kind of thing about most bats is most bats are polygynous. And again, I say most. Do we know every single bat? No. But this is also common in many mammals. And given lactation and pregnancy, male parental care really is not huge in bats. All right. And how does this polygyny work? Well, males usually either defend a group of females, like they do in Phyllostomus cystatus, or they defend a roost site. And so there can be favorable roost sites that are defended by your kind of top males. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about that when I move on. And so the last thing I just want to, this is a bit of an older one, but I wanted to emphasize why this kind of group living is important, right? Because notice there's also, the main point of this is there's all sorts of arrows, right? Who disperses the mating system, their social behavior, the parasite load, okay? Physiological demands like thermoregulation and cooperation. So we really need to, when we're thinking about particularly in captivity or in the wild and their welfare, we really need to take their social structure and characteristics, mating system, etc., into consideration. All right. Hopefully everyone's with me. I know it's so weird because I can't see anyone, but we're gonna keep going. Okay. So I started with highly social. I'm gonna move, and we're still on the secret, lives of bats. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my work on vocal behavior. Okay. And I'm going to make the argument that, both, I'm going to try and have it both ways. I would argue that most bats use vocal communication extensively. Why? They're nocturnal. They're roosting, and you'll see more visual, particularly in your pteropodidae. But for example, primates, they use a vocal, but they use a lot of visual communication. Bats, not so much, right? And on top of that, we're going to specifically focus on our echolocating bats, our Microchiroptera, is that they have developed, their brains have already developed a mechanism for rapid audio-vocal feedback. Right. So if you think of things like, say, a dog, dogs' vocalizations are generally relatively innate. Dogs, if they're deafened, they still bark. And there is not evidence in almost all mammals for auditory feedback, especially not to the level of what humans do. But echolocation itself, and I'm not saying that echolocation is talking, But I am saying that there are neural structures in these bat brains that rapidly take and they produce an echolocation signal. They interpret, they have their auditory system detects the resulting echo, which wires right back in to how they modify that vocalization on its way back out. And all of this happens within hundreds of milliseconds, right? And indeed, if I could put another thing down for bats, is bats work at warp speed, right? Not all, some of your pteropodids don't, but one thing about bats, their whole, our time, we do everything essentially like in slow motion compared to bats, right? So I argue that a lot, part of the reason that we have such widespread vocal communication in bats is not only because they're in pretty dark environments, but particularly in your echolocating bats, they already have an audio vocal system. They already have specializations for echolocation, all right? And indeed, in some species, this is the Brazilian free-tail bat, who I also spent a lot of time with, along with, sorry, I don't know where my things went. There she is. Barbara and Amanda, I think Amanda might be around, who had their captive Brazilian free-tail bats. And this is Barbara's captive colony, the barn. And generally, so a couple notes, unlike the phylostomids that you saw where bats hang, and we always think of bats like hanging from things, and it's not that Brazilian free-tail bats can't hang, they just actually don't like to. They like to be crammed into things. They like to be pocketed inside something, and I'll give you another example of that. Now, the great thing about Barbara's colony is that they had gotten pretty used to us people. So we could, and Barbara and Amanda had really figured this out. I just came in and kind of scientificized it. So during the year, these are kind of little recites, right? These little pouches. And yes, Barbara knew every single bat by name and by sight. I never got that good. I could only recognize like 10 of them. And during the year, they're all kind of mixed up in there, right? And then mating season would come around. And when mating season came around, these are all the males. Each male would set up a pouch that was its territory. And in fact, this one is, I'm pretty sure this is Ben. He's he's here. And inside his pouch are females, only females. Hello, polygyny. Hello, a harem. Right? And here I would argue this is an example of resource defense polygyny, right? Because they defend their pocket, right? And then the females, if they're going to mate with the male, they go in. And so normally the males are pretty mellow. There's not a huge amount of fighting, but boy, do things there's a female back here. These are two males duking it out. They're also, I actually didn't have time for the video. They're oozing the really stinky Gular gland stuff, and they're rubbing it all over everything and rubbing their penises all over everything. You really know when it's mating season and it's a Derrida colony, right? But I wanted to focus, so there's some of the behavior, but I want to focus on their vocalization. So first, to emphasize this whole bats go at Mach 10, right? And I'm sorry the quality isn't the best. You're like, oh, wow, that's really boring. And look, they buzzed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and slow that down. Oh, let me go here. There we go. Right. So did I mention bats go really fast? And indeed, we started characterizing their songs. I'm just going to play a couple for you. I'll slow down. Okay, and this guy. Right. So it ends up to do some really crazy things. They produce these elaborate songs. Not just that, and I'm running out of time, so I have to go really fast. That they're not just, even though I picked songs here that were kind of trip, trill, buzz, the main point is that there's different components. they put them together, but they vary how they combine them from like one rendition to the next. And part of that we've learned has to do with context, right? So we've got, hopefully highlighting some bat complexity here, but I also want to go back to behavior, right? So where did these, I was actually at Texas A&M, and unfortunately they've been removed, but this giant stadium, not only was it great for football, it was actually really awesome for bats. There was like, we don't even know how many, probably 1 million living in there. And they basically, where do they roost? So this is actually a concession stand, by the way. Well, this is a bathroom next to the concession stand, right? So again, you're envisioning bats like hanging. No, they don't hang. They are crammed in between the concrete here, right? Do you see all that? That's all bat guano, right? And there are tons and tons of bats, and they basically go in these crevices, and it is not random. So particularly during the mating season, you can go, if I start a recording right here, I pick up one male song. I move 5 feet down, I pick up another male song. I move 5 feet down, I pick up another male song. So the males are guarding roost sites along this giant, beam. And if we go out there, and this is from this location here, if I play an echolocation pass, like a bat is flying by, they go crazy. They produce songs. And this is across, I think, 15 different bats, right? And they do this instantaneously. They don't respond to song, which is kind of weird, right? So this is their behavior in the wild. And you're thinking, oh, they're not going to do this in captivity. But I also, at Texas A&M, worked with a captive species. And I wanted to highlight a couple things here. I really like this colony because 1, they can fly, okay? 2, never food on the ground, ever, ever, ever. Although we did have also a ladder in case they did fall on the ground, they could climb back up. But we also put in these tubes, right? And so these tubes are roost sites, okay? Now, there are a lot, and this only shows 4. We had a bunch of other ones, and they would also notice sometimes roost up in these corners, so they didn't have to roost in a tube. We also had towels over particular locations so that they could roost under a towel but not be in a tube, so we gave them a lot of variety. But what you found is within a tube, so here they are, they're up at the top. The other thing that's really cool is we could screw the tube off and capture the whole group without stressing them out too much. And lo and behold, in these tubes, you have a bunch of females and 1 male. And indeed, if you mess with them a little bit, I promise no bats got hurt, right? So here's your territorial male. He's got a female in here. And we're going to be a little mean and add another male. Sorry, dude. Like, huh? What's going on? And I'm gonna fast forward a little bit. This poor guy's like, what's up? What's going on? And this male's like, oh, no, you don't. Right. So got a little bit of a fight. And again, no one got hurt. Oh, why does the RG stop playing? Here we go. I fixed the video for a second. It's not perfect. There we go. So he's basically headbutting. He's like, no, this is my territory. You're out. Now, did anyone get hurt? No. That's another thing. Even though you see a lot of open mouth, a lot of that is signaling, right? It's signaling. It's not, I'm going to eat you. It's, the reason why they face each other face to face is, look, I'm bigger than you. And they also produce a lot of buzzing sounds, which are about which represent, in a way, how fit they are, how good their respiratory system is, as well as how big they are, right? Now, we did another thing. We've got males. I think this is a different male, but we've got a male in here. And all we did was release a bat to fly by. And then we put a regular and an ultrasonic microphone in there. And you can hear their little feet. But it's generally quiet. You see the bat flying? Oh, my sound's kind of sounding weird. You should be hearing some buzzy sounds. Oh. All right. Well, you can see what's happening, but for some reason, Maybe let me just see if this makes it work. There we go. I don't know why the audio was off. I think. All right, for some reason my audio is being weird. It was working earlier, but let me just show you the sounds, right? So notice everything's quiet, everything's mellow. We have a bat flying. There's its echolocation. This is the male that's in the roost. So notice everyone's quiet. You get a flying bat. Male starts calling his head off, and unfortunately we couldn't hear it very well. I note that to us, all we hear, this line is what we hear, right? And it's essentially buzzing. We hear a bunch of buzz, 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 buzz. But if you slow the sucker down, this is what you have. All right, so, and this is all in 2 seconds. So again, bat speed, man, it's killing us, right? All right, so those are some examples of what Brazilian freetails do. These are molosses. I know I'm getting a little low on time. This could be another whole talk, but it's not just Tadera that do this. I started looking at the evolution of these songs. So these are all molossid species. This is Tadera teniotis. I'll just play a couple. It's all slow down. The other thing note is these are all on the same scale. Tadera teniotis are really big, wingspan about here, compared to Brazilian freetails, and they also sing really slow and lower frequency. One of our other guys, these are Nyctinomops, they're down in Mexico. And then I'll do one of the molosses. Why don't we do one of the molossus species? Why don't we do Molossus rufus? Here we go. Right. All right. So, and we have confirmed that behaviorally, all of these are produced in a similar context by males at a roost location. But note, the complexity differs. So basically, I would call these more like a call. They're not these elaborate songs that we're seeing, for example, in Tadera brasiliensis. And there is a lot of variation, right? And so I'm going to go, part of what I've done is, and along with others, is look at, okay, what are bats doing across species? So here we're looking at courtship calls and songs. And there's some things I want to highlight, right? Each of these are families. And songs have evolved at least, well, actually I need to add, I think mystocinity or more in the song, have evolved independently in at least 3 different groups. These elaborate songs. Singing, is not the default. There are many, and I'm sure there's many might find singing in some other species. But let me tell you, for example, our Vespertilionic. Big brown bats, they don't sing. I've recorded them. They do some interesting sounds, and I've got an example, but they're not singers. However, pipistrelles in Europe, they have some singers, right? So same family, you can have singing bats and non-singing bats, some that produce calls, some that don't really call that much at all, etc. Now, another aspect of this, remember I had these guys, these Nyctinomops. I need to go do more research, but we did have what looks like vocal learning. So these are 2 bats. Actually, this is a bat calling on top of my playback. So if you look at these images, note, this is my playback. And so this is not an echo. This is actually a male singing, not singing, but calling. Right, so we would play these, and over time, they would be we couldn't tell which was the bat and which was our playback, right? It's still unpublished, still trying to get down there and work some more on the Nyctinomops. So what does that say? That says, well, we might have vocal learning. And I know this is a lot of information. So basically all I'm trying to say, we have our phylogeny. There's some evidence consistent with vocal learning in some families, but definitely not in others, right? There we really have not shown, I mean, they say promising over here. There has not been conclusive evidence of vocal learning in Vespertilianids like big brown bats, even though we've had them in captivity forever. So although some bats can sing and do some really crazy things, not all bats can. All right, so just a few more. What about some other bats, some other vocalizations? These are big brown bats. And this was in 2014. This is our echolocation, and they would produce these, what they call frequency modulated bouts while they flew. And this is in the moss lab, by the way. So we have two bats flying. And they're still kind of cruising around. So one, notice they're interacting with each other while flying. Okay. And one bat produced this, see this blue? These were these FMBs. That bat then goes and gets the worm. All right, so the argument here is that they use these essentially to claim food. Okay. But, I highly suggest you look at this work by Dr. Wright and Dr. Moss on the FMBs. More recently, I've been working, this is unpublished, I've been working with some undergrads. We brought some bats into a temporary cage with a single food bowl for two bats for 10, I think we did about 10 minutes and recorded their vocalizations. And guess what? They were making these FMBs, connecting them to buzzes, and they made them like all the time. We ended up with 953 FMBs, and we only had like 3 hours, altogether a couple hours of recordings. So what the bats were doing is that these FMBs were basically kind of part of their repertoire of arguing, squabbling, claiming food. Right, so they're not only produced in flight, but they're also produced in roost. And currently, we're doing another experiment similar to this, except for we're not reducing the food, and we are actually pairing bats that are because we have multiple captive roosts. We're comparing bats that have roosted in the same colony with bats that have never roosted together, right? And these are all, of course, at this point, they've been established in our lab. They're all vaccinated, etc. But we have one colony that's on the roof of the building. We have another colony where inside the building, and then a third where bats are in a group of bats that had just gone through quarantine and we hadn't released them yet. Right? We're finding all sorts of interesting info, but we are literally analyzing that as we speak. All right, so my last slide, because I saw there were a lot of people from Florida, and that is the Florida bonneted bat, which is I absolutely love. And note, here's their echolocation calls, but they don't just produce echolocation. They produce tons of social calls. And indeed, I'm gonna see if I should have a sound on here. Hold on. Let's see if it'll work. I guess it's too quiet. So these sounds you can actually hear, but let's see if we can try this again. Yeah, for some reason my audio is not doing very well. Another time, but you can actually hear those. And so I joke, I was sitting out, I moved to Florida, I was sitting out on my back porch drinking wine, and I could hear these, right? These are actually audible, right? And so I went and ended up doing all sorts of work on these guys. And we are currently analyzing these vocalizations. But we had upwards of 80% of echolocation passes during particular times. 80% had these social calls in them. So one extremely important aspect of the Florida bonneted bats conservation is their social behavior. So last thing, take homes. Hey, I guess I'm a little late, but pretty close. So what are my take home messages? Bats are very social. And it can vary, right? I'm not saying that they're all social in the same way, But again, very few bats are solitary. Like, there are some, but it's very rare. And that this social behavior is crucial to their well-being, right? Bats are also very vocal. That is also crucial to their well-being. That's how they communicate. What does this mean, right? So this means what I would recommend whenever having a colony is to create variation in roost sites, not just have 3 locations that are the exact same size or a big open area. You have, in fact, what I've done with Corolla, we basically put up colanders, right? Like you use for your vegetables. One great thing, they're made of plastic. 2, they come in different sizes. So we basically fixed different size colanders to the ceiling of their captive colony. And guess what? They have, some bats really love the small one, some like the bigger one. You often have males defending the locations. We have so much more what I would call normal bat behavior. All right. And so not only is it a matter of, okay, have some that are closer to warm, that vary in temperature profile, but they should also vary in whether or not they're defendable, how big they are, how big the social groups would be that got in there. Right. My other recommendation, always check your soundscape. Remember, most bats and all the communication is ultrasonic. Make sure you don't have a bunch of ultrasonic noise in there. And consider potentially putting in some sort of baffles, because if it's an empty room, the echoes are just going to be really difficult for them to actually hear each other, not just vocalize with each other, but much less even think. And that's it. And so I will stop my share.
Thanks, Casey. First question, I guess we have some folks that want to get hold of your bat beam videos.
So so this is, so you might, I believe, let me type it, hold on, because the website changed a little bit. Try Bat Lab JHU, and you should get to the Moss Lab. And I think I don't know, and you can tell me if you can't find them there, but they should have a link that is specifically to videos.
Okay, thank you.
Some of them are, and I'll one last thing. Some of those are kind of, I know that they're kind of old, but and they do have some newer ones. They also have some really cool ones showing 2 bats flying and 1 bat just basically stops echolocating and basically is listening off of the other bat. I got some really crazy stuff in there that the bats do.
Next question is, can you describe how you mark or ID a bat?
Right. So one, it's really hard to do this with little bats. I wouldn't do this probably with Vespers, but again, one thing I want to note, Phyllostomus' status is the 2nd largest bat in the Western Hemisphere. I don't know if any of you have worked with Artibius. They're about that size. So they're about this big. So we did have enough space. So what do? We caught the group. We did just use plain old Clairol Beach and a Q-tip. We left it on for about a half an hour, thoroughly rinsed the bats and released them. And we did this multiple years, and we didn't have any casualties. We would actually do this, then we'd leave for a month and come back because it kind of messed up their roosting. But after a couple of weeks, they'd all go back and start roosting together again, and they didn't know. I think that there has been some luck in our lab also doing that with Corolla. Because it is a little bit toxic. You want to make sure you rinse it off. But I have to say, it was permanent. That stuff lasted for like a year.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain the blood sharing among vampires? Does one bat just latch onto the other, or is
it's
it
regurgitation? So it is
regurgitation?
Right. It is complete regurgitation. If you go to socialbat.org, I think it should still be his. You should be able to see a lot. This is Gerald Carter, and kind of a little bit of inbreeding. This was Jerry Wilkinson. If you don't know of Jerry Wilkinson, Oh, I can't type. Hold on, Wilkinson. And by the way, I did my PhD work with Jerry Wilkinson as well. So I'm going to save that.
Okay.
Right.
I think we have time for one more.
Oh,
Rep-
well, I can do really quick. I haven't worked with neutered males, free tails.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask.
I'll say I haven't worked with them.
Okay.
I don't, I wouldn't be, I don't think, so this is the other thing. They also do this in flight. And so I think it's more than just a territorial call. I mean, they also produce these in flight. So I would not be shocked if they produce vocalizations. I don't think this is like songbirds where only males are capable of doing it.
Okay, thank you.